Ke te mihi atu ki a koutou katoa, e tai mai nei mō tēnei mininga nui, mō tēnei hui nui, o te rā e pāniki tō tātou ahorangi hau, ahorangi nui ki a koe Michael i tēnei wā, ke te mihi atu ki a koe, mō tēnei wā ki te whakanui a koe i roto i tēnei tūranga hau, kua ea koe, kua eke koe ki te taumata, nā reira ke te tino mihi atu ki a koe te rangatira Michael, o tira ki tō whānau e tai mai nei i tēnei wā, ki te whakanui i tēnei wā honuhonu, i tēnei wā pai, i tēnei wā miharo. Nā reira ke te mihi, ke te mihi, ke te mihi atu ki a koe. Ke te mihi atu ki a koutou katoa, e tai mai nei, ngā whānau, ngā ahorangi, ngā kaimahi, ngā tauira hoki e tai mai nei i roto i tēnei whariwāranga o tātou nei o Waipapa taumata rau, koutou katoa, o te eti o koutou ngā waiwai tapu nei mai haere mai i roto i tēnei wāhi o tātou nei o rākei, Ngāti Whātua o rākei, ke te mihi, ke te mihi, ke te mihi. Me mau mahara hoki, rātou kua whetirangitia ki tū o tā ārai, moi mai, moi mai rā. O tira ki a koe hoki a John, tō tātou manukura, ke te mihi atu ki a koe, hoki i tēnei wā, o tira ki ngā ahorangi katoa, koutou katoa, e mātakitaki mai, whakarongo mai ki tēnei taonga me ki i konei. Nō reira i roto i tēnei, kei te tino mihi atu ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora, on behalf of the science faculty, as a kaiar here, I warmly welcome you in our traditional Māori way into this space and on this auspicious occasion, ki te whakanui I tō tātou ahurangi hau for you, Michael, at this time, and just what a blessing it is for us all to come in for this evening to honour you for this occasion. Nā reira ke te tino mihi atu ki a koe, o tira ki a tātou katoa i tēnei wā. So everybody that is gathered here, esteemed guests, family members, past friends, and I heard like 20 years ago some as well, and 22 years as well. Those that have come here today, welcome, particularly those that have come to the space for the first time as well. And kia koutou katoa, kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. As we do in these traditional welcomes as well, we finish off with a waiata. And don't worry, whānau, it's a very easy waiata that you can all sing together. It's called Te Aroha. So if we could all be upstanding, please, and we'll sing that twice. Me tīmata tātou. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari e, tātou e, anō, te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari e, tātou e, kara tātou, me noho. Nā reira i roto i tēnā, kei te mihi ki a koutou katoa i tēnei wā, kei te mihi ki a koe, Michael, ka hoa te rākau ki a koe i tēnei wā, a honi. Kia ora.
Thank you, Tauriki. Kia ora koutou. I'm John Hosking, Dean of Science. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Waipapa Taumata Rao, the University of Auckland, and the inaugural lecture of Professor Michael Hautus. Michael works in the area of psychophysics, which sounds like a crossover episode between Friday the 13th and Doctor Who. But it is in fact the study of how physical stimuli become subjective psychological perceptions, how we see the world, really. He specialises in the application of signal detection theory, or SDT. I was saying to Michael before that I better not confuse that with STTs, which is something else entirely. So it applies SDTs to the study of psychophysics. SDT enables quantifying ability independently of performance by separating sensitivity from response bias, and is used in a very broad range of applications in addition to psychophysics. Michael did his PhD here in Auckland, working with John Irwin, graduating in 1993. Joined the lecturing staff of the then Department of Psychology in 1999, working his way through the ranks to his recent promotion to Professor, which we're celebrating tonight. His work with SDT started with his PhD and has continued and evolved since then, including its application to quantitative psychology, memory, sensory evaluation, pain, auditory neuroscience, mathematical modelling and decision science. He's one of the leading authorities in this area and has recently published Detection Theory, a User's Guide, 3rd edition, and is author of SDT Assistant, a software package widely used in SDT work. One of his more intriguing recent papers questions whether the touted most relaxing song in the world, Weightless, is in fact that relaxing. Tonight, Michael is going to tell us all about SDT and its adaptation to psychophysics. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for coming. I noticed something's actually happening on my presentation already which shouldn't be happening, and that is it suddenly inserted animations on everything, which wasn't there. So bear with me as I work my way through that. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is psychophysics then and now. And the contents of what I'm going to talk about are essentially rambling. I'm going to ramble across a whole bunch of different topics. I'm going to ramble on about the history of psychophysics, about Hautus, that's me, about signal detection theory, which is my primary interest, about some of my research, and just a taster of that. And the reason for just a taster is I want to bring in my colleagues that I've done research with and acknowledge the work that they've done with me. Then I'm going to go to something that's a little bit more serious, a crisis in the measurement theory and practice currently, which basically says we're at a point where everything looks a little bit less rosy than it may seem to people in terms of measurement theory. And then what am I going to do from now on, now that I'm a professor? And then I'm going to sort of give a little bit of advice, not really. I'm going to tell you what my pathway was going through an academic career. Okay, so a little bit of history and a little bit about the scope of my talk. Here we have 3 people from the distant past. These people, Ernst Weber, Wilhelm Wundt and Gustav Fechner, are often considered founding fathers of experimental psychology. This is where psychology as we know it today really started, back in the 1850s, 1860s. And for my area of psychology, psychophysics, that's essentially what they were doing back then. So most people who have done like stage 1 psychology will have come across, hopefully, these 3 folk. And Wilhelm Wundt is generally recognised as starting the very first psychology laboratory there ever was. So it all started there, and it was all about psychophysics. And then Ernst Weber came along. He actually came along earlier, but he didn't have a laboratory. And he came up with one of the famous great laws of psychology that there is, Weber's law, named after himself. And you'd learn that in stage 1. Well, you should. And then there's Gustav Fechner, who was a contemporary of Weber. In fact, they had the same supervisor. And Fechner, well, he had his own law that you should also learn, and I'll mention a bit later. But otherwise, he's pretty much forgotten and didn't get the sort of credit that he should have. So he's the hero tonight in what I'm going to talk about. And we're going to find out why he's the hero as we progress. So the last slide said local psychophysics. And, okay, so why do you have local psychophysics? Because there's another thing called global psychophysics. Local psychophysics is about confusable stimuli. It's stimuli that are very similar, stimuli that are very small, where if you try to make decisions about them, you're likely to get those decisions wrong some of the time. In fact, you're guaranteed to, because it's impossible to get the answers right all the time. They're confusable stimuli, and they relate to this whole area called detection theory or signal detection theory. So that's what I do. And then there's this other side over there, the global psychophysics. It's about how big your perception of stimuli is. Here's a glass of water that contains some cordial. Here's another glass that contains more cordial. How many times stronger is the second one than the first one? So it's looking at the distance, psychological distance between things that are not confusable at all. And the person who did the most work in this area was S.S. Stevens. And he came up with another law, which is written down there. It's called Stevens' law, surprisingly. And it shows the relationship between the strength of stimuli and the strength of perception. Now, another thing I should have said about my talk is we don't care about the details. So you see an equation, just look at it and say, oh yeah. Okay, it's the meaning that's important. It's what's behind it and the progression of ideas. Okay, so we've got confusable stimuli, and what we really want to do is separate out in people's decisions about those stimuli a thing called capacity, if you like, which is like how well they could potentially do what the system, their neural system, whichever system you're talking about, can do, as compared to their performance, which is what you get after they've given a response. So two slightly different things that we will come across. And that second one is not very useful, and it relates to a thing called response bias. Okay, so moving on from there. On the rambles, we're going to who am I? And, okay, so clearly not me, but yes, I did go into a lab and someone said, oh, down there's one of my students, why don't you go down and meet them? So I went in and said, hi. And the student comes up to me and says, are you Michael Hautus? Because they'd seen my software, and of course on my software I've got this little icon on it. That is an icon of Gustav Fechner. And they were expecting to see Gustav Fechner come in and talk to them. So maybe I do look as old as Gustav Fechner. But seriously, who am I? And I think there's two ways to look at that. One is to look at the academic heritage that I have, and the other is to look at the crucible in which I was born, the family heritage. So I'm going to have a quick chat about both of those, which will give you a better idea of me in two different ways. So here we have a family tree. This is an academic family tree, and we can see, if I put the pointer on, so you can see here's me down here. My supervisor was John Irwin, who I'll mention a little bit more about later. But if we go back through the supervisor of my supervisor, etc., all the way back through, we can come up to Stanley Smith Stevens, who I mentioned, with Stevens' power law was his thing. There was a major turning point in quantification of a large part of psychology. And then we go back through other well-known names. And then we go back to Wundt. That's where the first lab started. And that was in 1870, I think it was. And we keep going back and we get to Weber on the direct line. And then Weber's supervisor was also Fechner's supervisor. So those two came out of the same school, the Leipzig University, and had the same supervisor, who surprisingly is not very famous at all, but was a physician of some description. Okay, so how did I end up in psychophysics? Well, I ended up in psychophysics because John Irwin was in psychophysics, and I was excited about what he was doing. He ended up in psychophysics because of his supervisor. And this goes back and back and back, further and further, to create this interesting sort of lineage of ideas that has stayed intact fairly well all the way through us all. I said that Fechner had a law. Well, he did. Stevens came along and decided to come up with his own law, which was seen as an advancement on Fechner's law. It explained a bit more that was observable about decisions about sensory processes. And so he published this very cheeky titled paper to honour Fechner and repeal his law. And there's still debate about whether that law really is repealed or not. Now, who am I from another perspective? Who am I? What was it that made me me? So here's my family tree to one level. And I'll just say a little bit about what the background here was. So my parents came from Holland. And my father was born in 1914, so in the First War. And they both lived in a little town called Near. And during the Second World War, they were occupied. And my father, unfortunately, got taken off to one of the work camps and was there for a period of time. And I think by the time the war ended and he came back and they got married, they had enough of Europe. And so they decided to take their family to New Zealand. And before they did that, they actually had 3 kids here. And my oldest brother, we were a very religious family. He was a religious brother. And by the time they were here, not long after they got here, actually, a year later, another brother was born, and he had Hunter's disease. And so my parents had a very difficult sort of time in many perspectives in this regard. And then more were born, and there's me being born in 1965. Well, that's not me being born then, but that's when I was born. And you'll see with the ages there that I came 8 years after my nearest sister. So for me, it was like being an only child in many ways. So for people who like to look at family stories and look at how people relate and coming out of that, that's quite a mixed bag of things that were going on. And I think there was this, it was a very strange family to be in that regard, given the history that was there. And I think that really did have quite a strong effect on my tendencies to do things in certain ways. So, what did I do in certain ways? Well, it all started off quite well. Well, it ends up quite well as well, so that's not such a bad story. Okay, so what kid doesn't like dinosaurs? Here I liked dinosaurs when I was a kid, and here's an AI-generated picture of dinosaurs. I like playing with AI. It does the same silly things that humans do. It puts humans into pictures of dinosaurs when they never coexisted. Why does it do what humans do? We won't go there. So that's me at 5 years old. Now, my sister was a machinist and liked to make clothing. And so I ended up wearing clothing that she made. And so at 5 years old, I was trotted down for a photo shoot with this clothing on. And so that's me at the age when I was into my dinosaurs. But things moved on a bit from dinosaurs. Here's me at around about 9, 10 years old. And here I am in the corner of my garage, and I have a zillion different chemicals there that I'm playing around with. I became a chemist at 9 and really, really loved it. And unfortunately, I think I was quite a dangerous sort of chemist. Before I move on from my photo of being a chemist, there's my telescope. I was also an astronomer. I was out night after night for years on end looking at things through that tiny little thing that you could really not see much through at all, but it was exciting. Okay, so with all my chemicals and stuff there, and it's a cool picture. Thank you, Michelle, for making the cool picture. There are a whole bunch of other things that tied in of this sort of stuff. Astronomy, photographer, darkroom work, all sorts of stuff that were the acorns of interest and rabbit holes. And yes, I think I'm a person who goes down rabbit holes quite a lot and likes to go to the ends of the hole and get something out of it. And then I move on to something else. Now, the thing with my chemistry was that it was quite dangerous. And I remember I used to like playing around. What kid doesn't like making fireworks? And I remember one time at school, we'd made this firework that I took along to school, and a bunch of us boys went up to the back of the field, and we lit this thing. It was meant to just go bang. But instead, it didn't go bang. It just started oozing smoke, and more, and there's this big cloud of smoke. And you couldn't escape it. And one of the teachers there, Brother Bede, who was from Papua New Guinea, so he was a really tough fellow on everyone. He saw the smoke, he didn't know what to make of it, but we still ended up rolling the cricket pitch for many, many, many days after that, which was one of the punishments we had there. And then when I got to 7th form, I wanted to show people how you could make light without heat. And so we started mixing some chemicals in the lab during lunchtime and came up with a solution that was supposed to work. And our chemistry teacher said, oh, that's cool, we're going to the gem lab and we're going to make it dark and this will be one of the demonstrations that I do. Now, what do I do as a silly boy is I make it a little bit stronger than it's really meant to be, because more light's better than a little bit of light. And so we're in there and it's pitch black and everyone's silent. And all of a sudden the teacher starts pausing the stuff. You can't see anything happening. And all of a sudden there's this little orange glow and next minute there's this big orange splurt like that. And fortunately it wasn't hot and it wasn't that dangerous, but he did run out and got a very big fright from that. And I think that was the end point of chemistry for me. So at the end of school, which was pretty much when that was, I decided not to be a scientist anymore. Because I'd done science and you'd done it all, I thought. And let's do something else, because one of my maxims in life is whatever you've done, there's always something else to do. That's great. You can always do something different. There's always something that you can move on to. My idea was, hey, arts, let's do arts. So first year at university was a whole bunch of arts papers. I was going to be great at arts. It didn't work out very well. I haven't failed many papers, but they were that year, and that was the end of arts. Out the door, back into science, end of the story, moving on. Okay. Moving on into psychology. And here we have John Irwin at the red door to the sound attenuating chamber. And this was quite a number of years before I turned up. And the picture of me at the same red door is quite a number of years after John left. Now, John was a strong influence on me, particularly because he was in an area that I found fascinating, but also because his mentorship and guidance had purpose and it had passion, and I learnt a lot from it. And so I owe a lot. And in fact, I owe joining that entire family to John. The work then was mainly on sounds. That was John's primary area. But since then, things have moved on a little bit, broadened out, no longer just sounds. Now I've done foods, and earlier you heard a whole list of other areas of sensory experience and perception that I have worked in. But one of the longest sort of collaborations that I've had did involve foods. And it was with Daniela van Hout, Hessong Lee at Iwa Women's University. And we were sort of finding ways to measure differences between stimuli, in this case stimuli with food products, and products where you have an existing product, possibly, and then you want to modify it in some way. But you don't want people to know you've done that, because what you're really doing is either making it more cheaply or you're making it healthier, one or the other. And quite often those two things are traded off against each other. But we spent 10 years looking at various difference tests, which I'll talk about shortly. And in this project, Miriam, who's on the left there, was was entirely involved for the whole length of the project. Started off by doing a PhD in that area with that group, and then kept working afterwards for another probably 7 years on this. So without Miriam's help, this wouldn't really have come together. And it was quite an extensive project. So, sensory difference testing, what's it all about? Well, you can test sensory differences between all sorts of stimuli. And that stimuli, or those stimuli can have either internal variation, which means that the variation that causes you to get your answers wrong and discriminating come from processes that occur, let's just say neurally, internally, a part of your physiology. Or you can have external variation. External variation, such as, well, potato chips are a good example, and you've got salt on them or you've got a spice on them. Each time you have a chip, it's going to be a slightly different size, it's going to have a slightly different amount of additive, whatever it is. So you're actually tasting a slightly different external stimulus. And the differences between different chips are big enough to overwhelm any internal variation that goes on. And so that's what drives your perception. Now, another example there is old versus new faces, because this relates to memory. And so, yes, you can do this sort of testing with memory. And this sort of test, and I'll just mention this briefly, is one that will come up again later. Essentially, okay, we're talking about faces apparently. You take 10 photographs of faces. You show them to a person. You put them away. Now, you take those 10 photos and 10 other photos that they haven't seen of people. And then you present them one at a time to the person, and they have to say whether it was an old face that they'd seen before or a new face that they haven't seen. Very simple test. You can do it with faces, you can do it with words, you can do it with pretty much anything. And it's a really, really good test of memory performance. And we'll come back to that soon. Okay, so what have I done here? I've crossed out the word sensory. Okay, because back in the day, Fechner, our hero, used measurable stimuli and made rules about measurable stimuli. What do I mean by that? Well, his favourite one was weights. So he'd have little weights that were slightly different, and he'd have people lift them up and lift another weight and say which of the two was heavier. And that's objective because you know the mass of those weights, you know the physical value. In fact, Fechner got his wife to be a participant, and his wife listed about 100,000 weights, proving Fechner's theories. Later on, 1900, around about, Thurston came along. Now, Thurston did a lot of stuff, but the key thing he did in terms of this was that he moved the whole thing onto unmeasurable stimuli. So now you could take things that you can't measure, such as the beauty of handwriting. And we can't really measure what that is physically, but in psychological space, people know what it means. And what Thurston did was said we can use these methods to actually measure psychological space without actually having a physical measurement that goes with it. And that step meant that everything that's in your head is measurable. Which a lot of people still don't believe or know. So what's signal detection theory? Well, it came about in, 1953 was the year that the very first, not publication, but technical report came out about signal detection theory. And we can see where signal detection theory came from by looking back at what people said who came up with it. And essentially it comes out of statistics, in particular Neyman and Pearson's statistics, their lemma, and also out of Abraham Wold's statistical decision theory. So these are two things that were funneled in, and I mean, this is Neyman and Pearson's stuff up here. This is a picture of signal detection theory. We don't really care what they are, but they look similar. And the fact is that that was the modern evolution of signal detection theory. And then in 1966, the thing to note here is this is the original technical report. And was there something I was going to say about that? It comes out of the Electronic Defence Group in the Department of Electrical Engineering. So engineers originally came up with this thing. And then it passed over to psychology as well. And it was clearly in psychology by 1966 when Green and Sweats published their book on this topic, which is still the quintessential book on signal detection theory and psychophysics. So it crossed over into psychology at that point. Now, that sounds like a modern sort of history, but no, here's our hero again, because there is evidence, clear evidence, that Fechner had worked the equations for signal detection theory in 1860. But he didn't draw all the nice, pretty diagrams that we're used to looking at, talking about signal detection theory. Okay, there were developments, and it has been embellished, but the essential essence of it was produced by Fechner. Stephen Link, who some of you may know, went through Elements to Psychophysics and various other texts that are still in German and managed to track down that this is now, well, it's well accepted. So how broad is signal detection theory? Where can we go with it? There's three things about signal detection theory that are important. Some people know about one of those. Most people don't. There are two that almost no one knows about. But they are all really important. So I'm going to go through them very quickly. Response bias. Everyone, hopefully, most people know about response bias and how it confounds every single measurement you make of human behaviour. There's no exception. And whether you get responses such as yes or no responses, very simple sorts of things, whether you get responses about the nature of stimuli, whether it's that cheese I just had was a mainland cheese, or it was, what's the other one I got there? Anchor cheese. Whether you use rating responses for people, whether you use line scale responses, no matter what sort of response you collect, you're in trouble right from the start, because whatever you've collected, it has response bias associated with it. So signal detection theory provides a way to eliminate that problem in all those different sorts of responses. Okay, so that's the simple one, and the one that is usually touted in courses. The next thing it does, it makes your measurements of the difference between things independent of how you measure it. There's no other way to do that. Okay, so those names there, yes, no, paired, preference, same, different, etc., they're names of standard psychophysical testing methods. If you get a person to do each of those methods with the same stimuli, and then you try and get a number out of that, what you're going to get is a different number unless you use signal detection theory. So it enables you to get a unified metric, if you like, across different ways of collecting information out of people's psychological space. So down the bottom here, I've got some good measures, because signal detection theory, everyone talks about D prime, but that's just one measure. There are many that are very similar, some from detection theory directly, some from theories that are a little bit different but the same. So things like DA, log D, Michael, that counts. Log alpha. These sorts of measures work well. Bad to similar measures are things like PC. PC is the biggest measure that people use. Proportion correct. It's like how many you got correct over how many you did. You can make it percentage correct if you like. It's bad. It's bad. Never use that number. Oh, we use it in education. It's how we assess our students. Oh, never use that number. And then there's other ones less heard of, but they're equally bad. And they're all derivatives of each other. And the third one is decision strategies. And this is a slightly different one because you present information to people, sensory information, and it's structured in a certain way. It's structured by the way the task is done, and it's also structured in terms of the sort of distributions that are evident in your perception. So if you forget about the second one and just think about the different tasks that we have, we can have a task that there are two ways, let's say, to use that information to come up with a response. There may be many more than two. And here's an example here of exactly what this is. So there's a thing called the same different task. And in the same different task, you're given two things. And they're either the same or they're different. Let's leave it at that. Your job as a participant is to say they're the same or they're different. Simple. Now, there's two ways you can use that information to come up with your response. The information's the same, is how you use it makes the difference in what comes out. One is to use what's called a difference model. Difference model is essentially you pay attention to one of those things and then you pay attention to the other thing and you measure the difference between them psychologically and you use that to say whether they're the same or different. If the difference is large beyond some criterion, you say they're different, and if it's smaller, you say they're the same. Then there's this other complicated name thing, likelihood ratio model. And essentially what that means is you take each independent piece of information, each stimulus, and you make a judgment about them independently. So here's the first one, you say that was stimulus 1. And here's another one, that one was stimulus 1. Oh, they're the same. Okay, so you're making independent judgments. And what you get is different outcomes, different levels of performance, depending on the strategy used. So if you don't know how to extract the decision strategy out of your data, then the numbers you get can't be compared beyond the local context of what you're doing. So the RSC curves there essentially illustrate for the same different task that, well, you get different shaped curves depending on the strategy you use, irrespective of, we'll leave it there. So one set of curves is symmetrical, these are very symmetrical on this side, and these are asymmetrical. And that's what you get out of it. Forget about the data points, they're not really interesting. Okay, responses. What sort of responses come out of this? Well, here we've got things like satisfied and unsatisfied, preference of two products, liking of things, whether you would buy things or not. They're all decisions that work for things in the Fechnerian sense that you can actually measure and quantify the stimuli in the world, or in the Thurstonian sense that you don't quantify or you can't. Works either way. And you can see there's a zillion different ways you can structure these response styles. Okay, so those are the three things that signal detection theory can do for the world. Now, the interesting thing is when you start to put these things together in different ways. So you can have signal detection theory on signal detection theory. So assisted decisions. So here we have a smoke alarm. Okay, so the smoke alarm itself is a signal detection theory device. It takes in information, it has a criterion, and it makes a decision about whether there's a fire or not. Of course, sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. And then that information, what the alarm does, feeds into a human monitor, to someone who's there, observing, listening to the information coming from the alarm. That person also has a capacity for getting things right and wrong and has a criterion for making a decision to take action or not. And both of those can take information. Okay, so this could be smoke, of course, but it could also be visual cues. And the smoke alarm is going to pay attention to smoke, but the human may do that as well. But the human may use visual cues. So you get this sequence of information going through different detection systems. And that's more real world sort of stuff. If you go over to this diagram over here, you can see that we have a device here that does stuff. It's producing a medical image. It could be an AI device that's giving you advice on some sort of diagnostics or something else. It could be pretty much anything that produces information that a human consumes. And then you have the human who consumes it. Okay, so this device has a certain capacity to render information in a sensible manner that is more likely to be correct than not. But it's consumed by this device, which does the same thing. And so it was Sorkin, actually, who made a big deal out of these sorts of chained events, which a human is just at the end of the chain making a decision that's based on other things that are already doing signal detection theory type of things. Okay, so that's the signal detection theory sort of stuff. And that brings me to the next thing on my run of stuff to talk about, which is the book. Now, most people in the school, most of my colleagues have heard about the book. And the book was a huge project, and it started back in 2010 at Mount Desert Island when we were there on sabbatical and we were there with Neil McMillan and his wife Judy. And on the drive back, Neil says, I want another edition of this book, and you're the only person I know who will have the determination to do it. And I thought, do I really want to do this or not? And then I thought, well, yeah, I do. Another rabbit hole. And it took quite a while to get through that one. And so that was an enjoyable project. And the book is going really well. Now down here in this photo, we've got my colleague Haesong Lee. So this is in Korea. And there's Michelle, who is sitting right here. And Michelle helps in so many ways with my career and my life. But here's a concrete example in which writing chapters of books, hard work. You need someone who is really, really great at proofreading and suggesting improvements and making it clearer. And Michelle just kept on going with that. So thank you. This book is yours too. And then there's the software. Okay, SDT Assistant is the software I'm really going to talk about, but software is another rabbit hole for me. And so I think programming is fun, and I think that I've done it since I was around about 15, which is when the first personal computers started to appear. And did a course at University of Technology, or whatever it used to be called, on programming, anyway. And Delphi was the language that I always used. And here's a sort of a rabbit hole example of this. I thought one day, wouldn't it be fun to have a project? Oh, okay, let's write some rostering software for hospitals. Yep, let's do it. Put it together. So we did it, and we had it running in the emergency departments at Auckland and North Shore Hospital for about 3 years. And it worked really, really well. And they really wanted to keep going with it, except that you know what happens in organisations. They want software that does everything, not just one little specialised job. And so after 3 years, that hobby went away. There's me falling down a rabbit hole, I think. AI did that as well. Here's the real software, SDT Assistant. Now this is being put together so that researchers can, well, do signal detection theory without getting major headaches and figuring out how to actually do that. And this has been under development for a long, long time. I remember the olden days, there were things similar to performance reviews. And I had one with Michael Davison, and I said, oh, I've written this software. And he said, you should do some more with that. You should make it better. And so I did. And 66,784 lines of code later, we have version 3. So anyone who likes to play with that software, you're welcome to just get it off my website. And more of the rabbit hole going on here. Not enough just to do writing software. Writing software itself is straightforward. It's relatively easy. No, I want it to go as fast as it can go. And so here we have some assembly language code that I spent, there's thousands of lines of this, spent quite a while writing, and it made software that would take 3 days to run in an hour back in the day. And over here, we've got extremely optimized sort of mathematical equations that break the huge equations down into common sections, and then each section's only calculated once, and it's just that simple result that's used moving through. And not saying this for any particular reason other than to emphasize my approach to doing things, is sometimes to get carried away with it. Okay, so some examples of some research that's going on. Music and weird beats, Daniel Shepherd. Hello, Daniel. This is one of Daniel's areas, really, and I've been joining in on this for a while. What are you doing there, Daniel? And in this particular example, we were looking at whether binaural beats can facilitate autonomic recovery. In other words, make you relax after you had some stress. And binaural beats are pretty fascinating things. And essentially, you take two sine waves that are slightly different in frequency. So if you hear each of these, one would be beep, and the other would be beep. So they sounded the same, but they were a little bit different. And you take these and you stick one in one ear and one in the other ear. And so somewhere in your neural system, in the auditory pathway, these two signals converge and you get a third beat, a third sound that doesn't exist out in the world, but exists and is constructed neurally, which is really fascinating. And the other thing about binaural beats is people always talk about entrainment, how you can have these beats and they sort of synchronize with certain wave bands of neural activity. And so it's a fun thing to see if it can actually change how quickly you recover. And the short answer is from this particular picture is that it did. So this is sitting in silence after being stressed, and this is your skin conductance. And so your skin conductance gradually decreases and then sort of levels off, plateaus around here. Whereas for all these other things down here, these represent listening to binaural beats. And so you get a deeper recovery. So it's quite fascinating. And I keep getting invitations to conferences, nursing conferences, to come and talk about binaural beats. Do you get those, Daniel? Yeah. Then there were the cogneuro years. And cogneuro years, I think my main collaboration in the school was with Blake Johnson. And we looked into dichotic pitch, which is really quite similar to binaural beats in a way. It's actually quite different as well. But we'll say it's very similar. And essentially you take two sounds, but instead of them being just sine waves, they're bands of noise. One band of noise has got a notch in it, the other band of noise is very thin. A very narrow band of noise actually sounds a little bit like a tone. It's sort of got a woo sound going on. Whereas this broad noise here, this stuff, is just a hissing sound, like you get with water, rain falling on your roof. And you can time shift a little part of that narrow bit there, this bit, which actually temporally looks really weird like that. And you can then do exactly what you do with binaural beats and put copies into each ear. And hey presto, you hear this sound that is off to the side. So it's lateralized. Okay, once again, something that's produced neurally, internally. It doesn't exist out in the world. And because there's either one object, just the hissy sound, or one object plus the you've actually created two auditory objects. And so what we were looking at was how the brain actually detects auditory objects and how it can discriminate whether there's one of them or there's more than one of them. And Vima was heavily involved in this project, and everyone in the faculty knows Vima. And Blake ran away to Australia, and Vima wanted to do a PhD. So I ended up supervising Vima through a PhD when I would not really consider myself a cognitive neuroscientist, but we did really, really well, and VEMA did excellently. Then there were the texture years, and this is like, what is textural complexity? That's a question I'm interested in. And we got the money because we were looking at, does it influence food consumption, which is a big thing, and something that I'm not so interested in. So my main interest was in textural complexity and what that is. And so what is textural complexity? It's when you have a food product that has multiple textures, it's perceived as being more complex. And if it only has one or two textures, it's seen as being less complex. And what we sort of found was that, well, that's exactly how it works. More interestingly, what I found, and more relevant to this, is that when dealing with a lot of scientists, they very rarely distinguish between the physical world and the perceptual world, or the psychological world. Two different things. And John taught me to always separate those two things. And it's true. There is a physical world, and then there's your perception of it. They're related, but they're completely different things. And so when some scientists talk about textual complexity, they're talking about instrumentation measuring stimuli and stuff. It's a physical thing. Whereas when I talk about textual complexity, well, in this case anyway, I'm talking about what your perceived experience is, that you would call complexity. And mapping those two things is the real challenge. And then we've got not too much time. Okay, so I'll go through these quite quickly. So this is a different one. So this was with Mei Peng, another PhD student. And what we were looking at was the difference in people's ability to detect a certain compound, beta-ionone, which is essentially at low concentrations gives off a violet, the smell of violets. And what we were interested in doing, well, what I was interested in doing again, was looking at the methodology of this. And there are these things called psychometric functions that are sort of S-shaped curves that look like this, that show the strength of a stimulus physically and some measure of your perception of that stimulus on the other dimension. And so what we essentially showed in this case was that because there are two different genotypes for beta-ionone perception, people who are sensitive or insensitive, we were wanting to know what characterises the difference between them. And of course, the threshold itself will be different because that's by definition what's going on. But what's really interesting is that the shape of the curve is actually quite different. So this curve here for insensitive people is actually much steeper than the curve for sensitive people. So what this means is that there's a difference in the way that encoding is the most likely thing happens for insensitive or sensitive people of this product. The more interesting thing yet again is that most people don't actually consider this aspect of psychometric functions, let alone deal with them at all. The other thing is you can get ROC curves out of this sort of data as well. The current project we've got with olfaction is sort of starting, shall we say. And what we have here, a bunch of ideas that sort of tie together in some ways. At least we think they will. Olfactory thresholds tend to decline as you get older, if you get a coronavirus infection, and for some neurological disorders. Okay, so it can be a marker of changes in the brain that occur. Then we know that olfactory thresholds can be improved with olfactory training and enrichment. So, you know, someone might think, oh, well, does it work the other way? And of course, there's no logical reason to think that it would, but maybe it could. And in fact, there is some evidence that suggests that cognitive function, especially memory, can improve with olfactory enrichment. What's enrichment? It means exposing people to different smells over a period of time, like daily, a different smell each night, and let it run through the night for many weeks. That's all it is. It's such a simple thing. So this is something that we're keen to look at, and Neve Patterson is sort of driving this project with us, and Daniel as well. Okay, the measurement crisis. So what's the measurement crisis? I think this is an important one, and it's important because we make measurements, and in this case it's about memory. We make measurements and decisions about treatments related to memory all the time. And we need to know that when we measure memory performance, that what we are measuring is a person's actual memory ability, not their response bias. Because if we didn't do that, we would have various scenarios, this being one of them. We would have scenarios where drug companies would come up with drugs that treat people, and the evidence says that this works, but the evidence is actually contaminated with response bias. And it may not work at all. And this drug goes global, and it may do nothing, or it may do harm. And so some of my colleagues, Karen Rotello, have done a whole bunch of interesting analyses of data. And this is an example of data that is actually collected from humans, and then you use resampling methods to actually look at what's going on in terms of your analysis. And now, type 1 error rate is sort of something that in statistics, at least in psychology, we often set to 0.05. We're willing to make an erroneous decision 5% of the time. And of course, setting it at that level sounds nice and dandy, but then through these simulations, what has been found is that they are very rarely in practice at that level. In fact, almost never. So we've got measures like D prime, A prime, and so D prime is meant to be good, isn't it? Yes, but no, look, the error rates are going up dramatically here, which is quite a worry, because when you get to that point, you've got 75% erroneous decisions about efficacy of whatever you're trying to look at. That's pretty bad. And so there's this other measure, DA. And DA is a measure that is a signal detection theory measure, but it uses unequal variance distributions. Okay, so it's a slightly more complex signal detection theory model. And it does a relatively good job of keeping the type 1 error under control. Now, no one uses it. There have been papers that say to use it, and they're ignored. And so at the moment, Karen is writing some work that this has actually come out of, which hopefully will be noticed somewhat more. Because these sorts of decisions, well, they're global decisions. Do we want a generating model? I'm going to skip that because and we don't need more measurement crises. Okay, there are more of them. I'll tell you about them another time. Okay, so what's going to happen going forward for me and for signal detection theory and for psychophysics? Well, I always find that it's good to look across disciplines, because signal detection theory is so broad, it doesn't just live in psychology, it lives in a whole bunch of relatively independent disciplines. Psychology, sensory science, diagnostics, a lot of computer work as well uses this. And so it pays to look across these different areas and see what are the differences and what has evolved within those areas. And so psychology is where SDT originally took off, and where I might say it is now languishing like nobody's business and disappearing from textbooks and vanishing, which is extremely wrong. And we've got and established very useful things down there, which I talked about before, being able to deal with response bias, decision strategies, and being able to get a common measurement out of different tasks. And then in sensory science, they came up with the idea that binomial distributions, which one assumes normally in statistics when dealing with proportions, well, they're over-dispersed. They're not right to use. We need to use something that's got broader tails to take into account extra variation. And so they've latched onto a little bit onto beta binomial distributions to be used. And then in diagnostics, they have incorporated covariates into signal detection theory. And they've been doing that for a long time. Psychology, we haven't been. And so the future is to bring these things together, and where one will end up with is something circling around Bayesian hierarchical regression with generalized linear models. Something in that space. Really complicated sort of stuff. Now the danger when you go to that complicated sort of stuff is that you lose the stuff that's come from before. So there needs to be a good handover and a good, well, that's exactly the word, handover of information to make sure you don't lose anything in that transition. Signal detection theory as it's known now and looked at now in 50 years will be for educational purposes, to teach people about it. But when you become expert, you'll be doing a lot more than that. Okay, so here's my A Road Less Travelled thing, which is my approach to academic life, to life in general, I think. It's to pursue your interests and let them evolve. Okay, don't focus on something and just stick with it. Get rid of it once you've done it to death. Move on. Have something else going on. Dare to be passionate about each of them. So only choose things to move on to if you're passionate about those things. That's about right. And for each of them, now this is the hard part, I guess, is to find a successful conclusion. Get something out of it. Get satisfaction. Get publications. Get whatever. Get what you need. And then don't follow the crowd. Everywhere I look, people are following the crowd. They're doing the stuff that's been done for the last 50, 60, 70 years and thinking it's right and it's good and there's nothing new and the new things don't matter. Don't go down that path. Don't follow the crowd. Find the new things, grab them and bring them to the light. And of course have fun. And fun, I like fun's good, but then satisfaction's good as well. And whatever you really want to get at, that positive thing, that's what you can pursue. Okay, and a couple of acknowledgements. Well, I did quite a bunch of those as I went through the students and things, but family and friends, of course, leading academic lights within psychophysics and elsewhere. All of my students, I think students are incredibly important to your academic pathway, academic development. They're the ones that bring new material, new ideas, new approaches. That is really important. And then people I haven't mentioned yet are my colleagues within the School of Psychology, Faculty of Science, and the university at large. Because one doesn't necessarily always agree with what these organisations and these colleagues do or say, and sometimes you do, but it all works. And it creates an environment that is conducive to being collegiate and to being productive and to having fun. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Michael. I had a fire alarm in my apartment block at 5:30 this morning, and I can assure you the human operator had no difficulty discerning what he should do. Thank you, Michael. That was great talk. We're over time, but we've got time for a couple of questions, so who would like to fire off? Yep.
In the study you had about binaural beats, most of those frequencies were underneath the human threshold. Do you find evidence to suggest that even if you can't hear it, that it's affecting you in a positive way?
So with binaural beats, the frequencies are low, But what's, you can actually, if you don't put them into each ear and you just play them out in the world in the ear, you also get a beating pattern. And it's the envelope of the sound that you're picking up, not the actual frequencies.
Another question? Yep.
So you talk about AI quite a bit, sometimes it's a joke rather than what you're doing. But how do you believe AI and or what we're seeing will actually affect this field?
Quite majorly. It already is. My colleague, Daniela Van Help, who was at Unilever, who I talked about, left Unilever and started up didn't start up, but joined a company and became the president, and it's called Agora, which is AI Agora. And what they do is they take data sets from major providers around the world, major food companies, and apply AI to that, and manage to extract out some interesting things that traditional methods haven't been able to. It's not to say it's the begin all and end all of anything, but there's already benefits coming out of that. So I think going forward, there'll be quite a lot of transformation.
One last question. Yep.
So as a take-home message for educators, if we shouldn't be using proportion tracked, what does signal detection theory say about how we should design an exam, for example?
Well, it's an interesting question. I guess if you start with multiple choice sort of examples, you can extract out something like D prime from that. Or you could actually extract out something that's a bit different. It's the area under the ROC curve, which is a proportion in itself. So the ability to interpret that becomes easier because people rather deal with proportions than they deal with some number like D prime that goes from 0 to infinity. 0 to 1's easier. So you can extract out that sort of information quite well. And yeah, good starting point.
Thank you, Michael. I'll perhaps have a chat with Michael afterwards. Nikki, you want to say a few words?
I was going to ask a question, Michael, but I've decided it's a rhetorical question, I'm going to answer it right now. This has revealed so much to me about how you approach your working life. I think Michael's done just about every service role there is in the School of Psychology over the years, and I was fascinated to see that you have done a lot of programming and computing, because remember everybody when Michael was the IT person in the department. And my question was going to be whether all your work with decision making made you yourself a quicker and clearer decision maker, because that's definitely reflected in the way you approach the tasks at school, in the school. And I really do think on behalf of everyone here, you are absolutely pivotal to keeping us going. Your institutional knowledge and your generosity in the work that you've done for the school over the years, especially around teaching, is really deeply appreciated by all of us here. So thank you
Nikki.
very much, Michael.